Thank you. Good evening. My name is Elizabeth Kirk, and I'm an Associate Director at the Center for Ethics and Culture. On behalf of Dr. Solomon and the rest of the Center, I'd like to welcome all of you to our first lecture in the 6th Annual Catholic Culture Series. And before I ask our undergraduate assistant, Stephen Perdozo, to come up here and introduce tonight's speaker, I just wanted to say a few words about the series as a whole, because it is a lecture series, so the idea is that you will come back every week and that you will spread the word to all of your friends. So this series was originally intended to introduce Notre Dame undergraduates to authors whose works are of excellent quality and whose literary perspectives have a uniquely Catholic dimension. So our past series, and I see some familiar faces out there, so I know many of you have come before, have included such authors as Chesterton, O'Connor, Pearce, Evelyn Waugh, Graham Greene, Tolkien, and last year our Forgotten Authors series, which featured Unset, Miller, Bernanos, and Benson. So we hope we've educated a few undergraduates about these marvelous authors, and many of the folks in the larger community have enjoyed learning about this as well. This year, we've turned our attention to the man who many regard as the greatest English language writer of all time, William Shakespeare. And of course, because this is the Catholic literature series, it made sense to focus on Shakespeare's relation to Catholicism. Let me tell you, I have discovered over the course of the last year, in doing research for this lecture series and in helping to select some of our speakers, that there is a great deal of controversy over Shakespeare. Of course, there is the great authorship controversy. Were Shakespeare's works even written by Shakespeare? Or were they written by Francis Bacon or Christopher Marlowe? I don't throw out your favorite theory. The Countess of Pembroke or whoever. Do you have any favorite theories?
Elvis Presley.
There's controversy over the meaning of his works. There's controversy over his personal life. But there is no controversy like the one about whether Shakespeare was a closet Catholic. It's fair to say that the centuries in which Shakespeare lived and died were fairly turbulent ones for religion in merry old England. Anyone who's seen A Man for All Seasons can tell you all about how poor Henry VIII went from being named Defender of the Faith by the Pope in 1521 to Supreme Head of the Church of England in 1535, for which he was excommunicated by the Pope, a different Pope. During the reign of Henry's son, by his third wife, Edward VI, and under the influence of Thomas Cranmer, England traveled further away from Rome. And then a mere 6 years later, Edward was succeeded by his sister Mary, the child of Henry VIII's first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and she was a Catholic. So she asserted that England was once again a Catholic country and rolled back many of the changes that had happened under her father and her brother. And some of those measures didn't endear her to some folks, for which she earned the nickname that, or the name of the drink that we all know her by, I suppose. Mary only reigned for 5 years and was succeeded by her sister, Elizabeth I, the daughter of Henry's second wife, Anne Boleyn, and the first act of Queen Elizabeth was to annul all the religious restorations of her sister Mary. So in less than 25 years, England went from a Catholic country to a Protestant country under Edward VI, back to being a Catholic country under Mary, back to being a Protestant country under Elizabeth I. This was the world into which William Shakespeare was born. I know it's hard for us to imagine in America having a national religion at all, but to have 3 changes in the national religion in such a short time is pretty remarkable. And in light of this tumultuous history, I hope you'll appreciate a lecture series which seeks to explore Shakespeare's religious faith, what his ecclesial alliances might have been, and just the general extent to which a Catholic ethos exists in his works. So Stephen is going to introduce Professor Pearce, but let me just say a few words about the other 3 lectures. In addition to tonight's lecture, next Tuesday, Peter Holland, who may be with us in the audience tonight, He's the McNeil Family Professor in Shakespeare Studies here at Notre Dame. He's also the acting dean of our graduate school and the current president of the Shakespeare Association of America. And he will give a lecture next Tuesday entitled Cracking the Shakespeare Code. The following Tuesday, October 2nd, Professor John Finnis, who is here with us this evening, who is the Biocchini Family Professor of Law at Notre Dame and Legal Philosophy at Oxford, will speak on the audacity of Shakespeare's non-recusant Catholicism. And then finally, on Tuesday, October 9th, Claire Asquith, the author of Shadow Play, The Hidden Beliefs and Coded Politics of William Shakespeare, will present a lecture entitled Shakespeare's Dark Matter. And all of those lectures will be held right here in this room at 8 o'clock. Also, finally, there is a marvelous display in the Hams bookstore located on a table right as you walk into the bookstore, and you'll see our poster proudly displayed there, containing Shakespeare's works, some works by a few of our invited speakers, and then also several books devoted to just the general topic of Shakespeare and religion. So I encourage you to read those and to rediscover the Bard's works. So welcome again to our series, and with that, I'll turn it over to Stephen.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you all very much for coming. As Elizabeth said, my name is Stephen Ferdoso, and I'm an undergraduate assistant at the Center for Ethics and Culture. Tonight, I have the honor of introducing our speaker, Joseph Pearce. Professor Pearce is the internationally acclaimed author of 14 books, which include bestsellers such as G.K. Chesterton, Wisdom and Innocence, Literary Converts, and Tolkien, Man and Myth. His books, many of which are biographies of famous Catholic writers, have been published and translated into over 8 languages. As a younger man, Pearce was extremely anti-Catholic, but eventually he converted to Catholicism as he learned more about the writings and beliefs of the literary converts he would eventually profile. As writer-in-residence and professor of literature at Ave Maria University in Naples, Florida, Professor Pearce also serves as the editor of the St. Austin Review, a transatlantic monthly cultural publication. Professor Pearce has lectured at past events for the Center, giving lectures on both J.R.R. Tolkien and the Catholic literary revival of the 1900s. And he's in the process of publishing a book about the relationship between Shakespeare and Catholicism. Tonight, he will give a lecture entitled, Will the Real Shakespeare Please Stand Up? Evidence for the Bard's Catholicism. Following the lecture, he will field questions from the audience. So if you hear something that you would like to have clarified, please just write it down and save it for the end. And now, to open tonight's lecture, we'll have a reading of Sonnet 73. By Notre Dame's own Philip Carl Smith. Thank you so much, Philip.
That time of year thou mayest in me behold, when yellow leaves, or none, or few, do hang upon those boughs which shake against the cold, bare, ruined choirs, where late the sweet birds sang. In me thou seest the twilight of such day, as after sunset fadeth in the west, which by and by black night doth take away. Death's second self seals up all in rest. In me thou seest the glowing of such a fire that on the ashes of his youth doth lie, as the deathbed whereon it must expire, consumed with that which it was nourished by. This thou perceivest, which makes thy love more strong, to love that well which thou must leave ere long.
Good evening. Let's get this thing sort of working. Put that there so I can walk. You can hear me even when I'm walking, yes? Good. Well, first of all, just a quick word on that sonnet 73. That it probably contains one line from Shakespeare, which is the least controversially sympathetic to Catholicism, in the sense that even those that oppose the theory that Shakespeare was a Catholic are quite happy to concede the Catholic allusion there and at least a nostalgic sympathy for it. And that's the line, "The bare ruined choirs where late the sweet birds sang." And of course, if any of you have been to England, you will know that England is dotted with ruined abbeys and monasteries that were destroyed by Henry VIII. And the way they destroyed them basically was merely to remove the roof and then let the weather do the rest. So in Shakespeare's time, these beautiful abbey ruins that you can still see now that survived for 500 years would obviously have been even more magnificent then than they are now, but the roof would have been removed and they were no longer open for worship, of course, because the bare ruined choirs where late the sweet birds monks sang. So again, that's an allusion to the nostalgia. Now, when we talk about Shakespeare and Catholicism, and will the real Shakespeare please stand up as the topic of this talk, we need to realize that we are involved in a very heated controversy. Someone has even called it the Shakespeare Wars. And speaking personally, I'm all for controversy. G.K. Chesterton said of his relationship to his brother that we were always arguing, but we never quarreled. And I think that, again, a controversy should be a good excuse for a good argument that should never descend into a quarrel. And, of course, the idea of an argument is you get both sides of the story, or indeed several sides to the story, with the idea that at the end of it, we're closer to the truth than we were beforehand. So this is the topic of my talk. Also, because it's so controversial, I'm hoping to leave time for questions, because, if we believe in controversy, then perhaps the question time might be the most exciting part of the whole evening. So I hope to have time for that. But also, I have an awful lot I want to say between now and then. So I'll push on. Now, my book, which I've actually finished, and it's at the publisher and should be published next spring, is called The Quest for Shakespeare. And my initial plan for it, this is just so you get the structure of this talk, my initial plan for it was to look at the biographical and historical and documentary evidence for Shakespeare's Catholicism. And then part two was going to be the textual evidence for Shakespeare's Catholicism, the evidence we can adduce from the plays and the poems and the sonnets. However, so the idea being that the two sides together, part one and part two, would form a sort of Gothic arch, where part one would support part two and vice versa. However, I decided in actual fact that although this is a great idea in theory, we were talking about two books. Because people would buy a book, The Quest for Shakespeare, looking at the evidence for his Catholicism as a life, as a biographical study, or they'd buy a book of literary criticism. But most people would not particularly be interested in both, and the two halves would be so different that they constitute two books. So my book is only looking at the documentary and biographical evidence for Shakespeare's Catholicism, although I am going to be working this next spring on part two, in which case I'll look at, I don't know how many yet, but say 10 or 12 of the plays, and maybe the sonnets, and Phoenix and the Turtle, that John Finnis has already written very well on. But that's the next book. So you're going to get basically Will the Real Shakespeare Please Stand Up? You're going to get the biographical, historical, documentary evidence for it, as opposed to the textual evidence this evening, which is just as well, because quite frankly, to try to do both in one talk would be doing an injustice to both. Okay, so will the real Shakespeare please stand up? Well, at the beginning of my book, I sort of say that the quest for Shakespeare is a bit like a detective story, where the author is a bit like a literary sleuth, so pursuing his quarry. But since the object of the chase is not so much the confession of a crime as the confession of a creed, that perhaps Chesterton's sort of literary sleuth Father Brown might be better suited for the job than the coldly logical Sherlock Holmes. But anyway, that's been my aim. And the quest involves three questions. Is Shakespeare important? Is Shakespeare Shakespeare? And is Shakespeare Catholic? Now, the bulk of my talk will be on the third of those, but I want to say something about the first two. Is Shakespeare important? Well, and I like being logical when I write a book, and if Shakespeare's not important, why bother with the rest of it? And certainly we live in controversial times where literary criticism is concerned, where many people would claim that Shakespeare as the author is not particularly important. His works, if you like, are disembodied from the personhood. I disagree with that, and I'm going to say something about that before we move on. But at the beginning of my book, I'm just going to, when I'm talking about the first two, I'm going to just read short parts from the book to illustrate the point. So is Shakespeare important? I refer to the fact at the beginning that critics can't even, historians can't even make up their mind whether any of the portraits of Shakespeare, the artistic portraits of Shakespeare, are really Shakespeare. There's no consensus even on that. So we don't even really know what he looks like. But perhaps the Chandos or Chandos portrait is the one that has the greatest claim for legitimacy. And when I look at that, I'm reminded very much of the Mona Lisa. Not because Shakespeare is sort of effeminate or anything, nor did the Mona Lisa have a beard. I say it because of sort of the enigmatic expression on the face, the almost smile on the lips, and the glint in the eye, and perhaps that's my projecting my imagination in. But as the portrait looks back at me, it's almost as if it's keeping its mystery, as indeed the Mona Lisa does. So let's look at that in a bit more detail then. And Matthew Arnold wrote a sonnet about Shakespeare in the 19th century, which contained the line, "We ask and ask, thou smilest and art still, out-topping knowledge, the elusive Shakespeare." Thus wrote Matthew Arnold in his sonnet to Shakespeare. Today, almost 400 years after Shakespeare's death, and more than a century after Arnold's sonnet, we are still asking. We ask and are still met with the same beguiling silence. Imagine yourself looking at the portrait. The same suggestion of a smile. Perhaps on one level at least, this is as it should be. On the level of metaphor, the Chandos portrait serves as a representation of Shakespeare himself. The man who looks at us knowingly from the canvas is the man who looks at us knowingly through the plays. He knows us, even if we don't know him. He shows us ourselves, even if he conceals himself while he does so. As with the picture of Dorian Gray, the portrait is a mirror. And if the mirror shows us ourselves, does it really matter that we can't see the mysterious man who is holding it? Is Shakespeare important? This seems to have been the question on Matthew Arnold's mind when he composed his sonnet. Arnold appeared to be saying that since Shakespeare shows us ourselves, does it really matter that he fails to show us himself? There is, however, a serious problem with such a conclusion, a problem which is so serious that it amounts to a fatal flaw in the reading of Shakespeare's works and a consequent blindness to the truths that emerge from them. That statement, I talked about controversy, is controversial in the sense that I'm effectively saying that the vast majority of Shakespeare critics don't know what they're talking about. What if the image of ourselves that we see in the mirror is distorted by our lack of knowledge of the one who holds the mirror? What if our understanding of Shakespeare is essential to our understanding of ourselves as reflected by Shakespeare? What if we misunderstand and misconstrue what he is showing us, if we misunderstand and misconstrue what he means to show us? What if Shakespeare is not simply holding the mirror? What if he is the mirror? What if the plays are, in some mystical or immanent way, an artistic incarnation of the playwright? What if the words only become flesh if we understand the personhood and philosophy of the flesh that gave birth to the words? Parche Matthew Arnold, it is clear that knowing Shakespeare increases our knowledge of the plays. It is equally clear that a misunderstanding of Shakespeare will invariably lead to a misunderstanding of the plays. Misread the man and you misread the work. This being so, it is evident that the quest for the real William Shakespeare is at the heart of Shakespearean literature. The quest for the author of the plays and sonnets is a quest for the authority needed to read them properly. Now, If you're in the sphere of literary criticism, those words are controversial. And I guess I want to say something very briefly about that, because I don't think they need to be that controversial if we actually think about it. From the pagan perspective, from the atheist perspective, and from the Christian perspective, there seems to be an agreement that there are two ingredients to creativity. One is the mystical gift. Homer called it the muse. Christians will call it talent, gift, or grace. And even Shelley, if you read his defense of poetry, talks about this mystical power. He even calls it a spirit, even though he's an atheist. He thinks it serves the zeitgeist, but regardless. So the atheist, the pagan, and the Christian are in agreement that there's this gift that comes in, the grace, or the muse, or the zeitgeist. However, this has led to a major misunderstanding. I'm not going to name any particular schools of literary theory, but let's just say most of them. That because there is, in some sense, a transcendent aspect to this gift, in other words, that you don't write a creative work in the same way as you hammer in a nail, with your full conscious involvement and you know exactly what's going to happen, because there's this transcendent aspect, therefore the intention of the author or the artist doesn't really matter. Well, that really is taking the whole thing much further than it actually should go. If you actually read Shelley, he's making it perfectly clear that the original conception of the artist is pure in its magnificence, and the fading cold image he uses, happens when he tries to write it down. So what he's really saying is that actually the poetry in the poet is more powerful than what he actually ends up writing down. So we shouldn't belittle, in Shelley's atheistic perspective, we shouldn't belittle the poet. We should realize actually, to go from one poet to another, what T.S. Eliot said in The Hollow Men, that between the potency and the existence falls the shadow. Now for Eliot, who was a Christian, the falling of the shadow was the shadow of the fall. That's what, if you like, nothing is perfect once it passes through the prism of fallen humanity. Shelley says the same thing, although he doesn't share the same theology. Tolkien says in one of his letters that only God himself, only one's guardian angel, or indeed God himself, could unravel the relationship between an author and his work. Not the author himself, though he knows more than any investigator. Okay, so an author can't really unravel the relationship with the gift in the sense of really getting hold of it. It's a mystery. Does this mystery mean that the intention of the author doesn't matter? Well, what does Tolkien say? That the author himself can't unravel this mystery of creativity, but he knows more than any investigator. So as we can't see this creative gift from the perspective of God or the author's guardian angel, what we're left with at the deepest level of understanding is looking at the work through the eyes of the author, who knows more than any investigator, before we go to anybody else. And let's look at this. From a Christian perspective, grace, God, does not write upon a human person as if the human person is a tabula rasa, a blank page. The artist is not possessed. What we actually see is an incarnation, that the gift comes in and the work that's expressed never negates the personhood of the author and is always a reflection of the personhood of the author, which is why Tolkien didn't write The Lord of the Flies and couldn't have written The Lord of the Flies, which is why Virginia Woolf didn't write The Lord of the Rings. Heaven forbid. So in other words, never forget the centrality of the personhood in the creative process, because the giver of the gift doesn't forget it. It's an incarnational thing. Okay. The creativity expresses personhood. So therefore, knowing the person of the author is the place to start. Okay, so is Shakespeare important? Yes. Is Shakespeare Shakespeare? Now, Elizabeth Kirk mentioned the fact, of course, that, did Shakespeare write their own plays? And I'm logical. Why would I waste my time looking into whether Shakespeare was a Catholic if A, he wasn't important, or B, Shakespeare wasn't the person that wrote the plays anyway? He was just some actor who went back to Stratford-upon-Avon. Well, I want to again read a little bit about this, because basically the Oxfordians, or the Baconians, or the Marlovians, or the Elvis Presleyians, all really based their arguments on a number of things. It's like a house of cards. Now, the Oxfordians and the Baconians have a wonderful edifice of great scholarship built up. But it's a house of cards. And with our house of cards, all we have to do is remove one of the bottom cards and everything else falls down. And all you have to remove is the evidence they have for the fact it couldn't have been William Shakespeare. Once you remove the fact it couldn't have been William Shakespeare, the rest of it, why it could have been the Earl of Oxford or why it could have been Francis Bacon, comes tumbling down. So, ultimately, all the rival theories can be disproved through the application of solid historical evidence combined with common sense. Take, for example, the central premise of the Oxfordian or Baconian case that the plays must have been written by an aristocrat, or at least by one with a university education, on the assumption that Shakespeare, as a commoner without a university education, must have been illiterate, or at any rate incapable of writing literature of such sublime quality. One of the key things. Only an aristocrat could have been as sublime as Shakespeare. Shakespeare wasn't an aristocrat, ipso facto, Shakespeare wasn't Shakespeare. Let's look at the facts. Shakespeare's father was not poor, but on the contrary was relatively wealthy. He was, furthermore, a highly respected and influential member of the Stratford-upon-Avon community. With regard to Shakespeare's education, the historian Michael Wood has shown that the sort of education that Shakespeare would have received at the Stratford Grammar School would have been of exceptionally good quality. I think he sort of compares secondary, a high school education at Stratford Grammar School up to the age of 16 with the best that Oxford and Cambridge can offer in the classics today. And Michael Wood is a reputable historian. And he's built that up by looking at curricula from other grammar schools at the same time as Stratford Grammar School. We don't have the curriculum of Stratford Grammar School, but all the other grammar schools that he finds from the Tudor period have very similar curricula, so we can be fairly sure that's what Shakespeare would have got as his education. On the other hand, the plays and sonnets do not display the great knowledge of classical languages, which one might have expected if Shakespeare had been an aristocrat, or, like Bacon, he had been to Oxford or Cambridge. Francis Bacon did much of his writing in Latin, whereas Shakespeare, to quote his good friend Ben Jonson, had little Latin and less Greek, although I said that's relative to then. With today, he's got a good classical education, and wrote entirely in the vernacular. The evidence illustrates, therefore, that William Shakespeare would have had a good education, but that he might not have been as comfortable with classical languages as he would have been had he been to Oxford or Cambridge. This excellent but non-classical education is reflected in the content of his plays. It should also be noted that Francis Bacon was vehemently anti-Catholic. His mother was a zealous Calvinist and his father an outspoken enemy of the Catholic Church. Such an upbringing would have been precluded from him from being able to write the profoundly Catholic plays attributed to Shakespeare. That's a non sequitur. I'm confessing it myself because I'm not arguing from the texts here. As for the presumption of the Oxfordians and Baconians that Shakespeare's humble origins would have precluded him from being able to write the plays, one need only remember that great literature is not the preserve of the rich or the privileged. Christopher Marlowe was a shoemaker's son, and Ben Jonson's stepfather was a bricklayer. Poverty prevented Jonson from pursuing a university education. Since Marlowe and Jonson, along with Shakespeare, are the most important dramatists of the Elizabethan and Jacobean period, it is clear that having humble origins did not disqualify a writer from producing great literature. On the contrary, it could be argued from the evidence that such origins were an important ingredient of literary greatness in Shakespeare's day. And again, I then quote later generations. Daniel Defoe was the son of a butcher. Samuel Johnson, arguably the greatest wit and literary figure of the 18th century, was also born of poor parents. Poverty would force Johnson to abandon his university education. Charles Dickens, the greatest novelist of the Victorian era, experienced grinding poverty as a child, and when his father was sent to prison for debt, the 10-year-old Dickens was forced to work in a factory. Moving into the 20th century, G.K. Chesterton, the Dr. Johnson of his age, was born of middle-class parents and never received a university education. Okay, so one of the first major pillars upon which they build their edifice is that a poor, humble, non-aristocrat could not have written these sublime plays and poems. That's clearly nonsense. So much for the weakness of the Oxfordian argument about Shakespeare's humble origins. The other argument, often employed by the Oxfordians, is that Shakespeare was too young to have written the sonnets and the early plays. Shakespeare was only in his mid-20s when the earliest of the plays was written, and was in his late 20s when he wrote the sonnets. There is no way that such a young man could have written such work, whereas the Earl of Oxford, being born in 1550, and therefore 14 years Shakespeare's senior, would have been sufficiently mature to have written these masterpieces. So the argument runs. Whether the Earl of Oxford, a most violent and volatile individual, was ever sufficiently mature to have written the works of Shakespeare is itself highly questionable. Nonetheless, let's look at the crux of the matter, namely whether a young man is able to write great literature. So I'm going to try to skim some of this because of the time issue. But Christopher Marlowe was only 23, 2 or 3 years younger than Shakespeare. He's thought to have been when he wrote the first of his plays, when the first of Marlowe's plays was produced. And it's generally considered to be the first of the great Elizabethan tragedies. He was 23 years old. Ben Jonson's first play was performed in 1598 with Shakespeare in the cast when Jonson was only 26 years old. Thomas Dekker, these are also obviously Shakespeare's contemporaries, published the first of his comedies when he was around 30 years old. Thomas Middleton was about 32. John Webster was 27. John Marston was between the ages of 26 and 31. So looking at his contemporary, Shakespeare was at exactly the age one would expect him to be when he first started writing plays. The early Earl of Oxford, on the other hand, would have been around 40 when the first of the plays was performed, making him a positive geriatric by comparison. And then, so much for the youthfulness of the playwright Shakespeare. What about the sonneteer, the writer of the sonnets? Looking at his contemporaries, Michael Drayton published his first volume of poetry when he was 28 years old. John Donne was in his late 20s or early 30s. Sir Philip Sidney was only 32 when he died. Robert Southwell was 33 when he died, and Christopher Marlowe was 29, and Thomas Nash was 34. All of these have left us with a great body of extremely good poetry. Samuel Johnson, moving on to the 18th century, was 28 when he finished his play Irene, and a year older when he finished London, his poem. And as for Alexander Pope, he published his first poems at the tender age of 21. And then we could carry on, and we will briefly. Byron, Shelley, and Keats. Say no more, really. Byron was 36 when he died, Shelley was 30, and Keats a mere 26 years old. As for the precocious talent of the youngest of the youthful trio, Keats is said to have written some of the finest sonnets in as little as 15 minutes. And Keats never even lived to the age at which Shakespeare is thought to have written his own sonnets. Okay. There are other things we could say here. The fact that his illiteracy is proved by the fact he's got a very shaky signature. And I merely point out, first of all, that the signatures are mostly when Shakespeare's almost dying. So he's got a shaky signature because he's sick. But in any way, I point out that there's no connection whatsoever between calligraphy and literacy. let it suffice to say that any scholar who has pored over the mercilessly illegible handwriting of great writers will note that there is absolutely no connection between legibility and literacy. And again, why is Shakespeare's will does have more of a literary flourish? Probably because it was written by his lawyer. Oh, sorry, Elizabeth. And again, why is his epitaph not a great work of poetry? Probably because he didn't write it. Who writes their own epitaphs on their own graves? In other words, so the arguments are flimsy at best and pathetic at worst. I told you I like controversy, didn't I? So is Shakespeare Shakespeare? Yes, because there's not any reasonable evidence that he's anybody else. Okay. Is Shakespeare Catholic? Well, I would say, first of all, that I'm not only a convert to Catholicism, I'm a convert to Shakespeare's Catholicism. Because I was a skeptic. When I first came to live in the United States 6 years ago, my colleagues on the literature department at Ave Maria University, they're not my present colleagues who don't necessarily share this view, so I don't want to be tarring anybody with the wrong brush, as it were. But my former colleagues were convinced that Shakespeare was a Catholic and taught the plays on that basis. And I was opposed to this. My attitude was there's not enough evidence. And we have to be honest. And the only honest position about Shakespeare that we can have is an agnostic one, that we don't know. We might be able to adduce Catholicism from the plays, but as I've said, the danger of that is, are we merely projecting our own prejudices into the reading of the plays, what we accuse everybody else of doing? So I thought we couldn't do that. We didn't have enough evidence. Then bit by bit by bit, now this piece of evidence would come at me, another piece of evidence would come at me, and I would actually add that Dr. Finnis is in the audience today, that his own article on the Phoenix and the Turtle was one of these significant pieces of the jigsaw puzzle. You know, and you get one and another, and then at a certain point a threshold is reached. And you think, well, hold on for a second. You know, there's quite a lot here. And at that point I decided to start researching it myself. And that was, I suppose, the genesis of this book. Eventually, when I read more and just thought, well, you know, there's so much here that it needs to be researched and told. So, I'm now going to sort of try to go through the chapters of my book, but using about 3 sentences from each as we move on. So, apart from the first chapter, which is called Will the Real Shakespeare Please Stand Up, which talks about the importance of Shakespeare, and also talks about the fact Shakespeare is Shakespeare, surprise, surprise. I then go on to his father's will, looking at John Shakespeare's spiritual will and testament. Basically, I think it's about 150 years after Shakespeare's death, dates sometime in the 18th century anyway. A spiritual will and testament was discovered in the hidden in the roof, in the eaves of the roof of the Shakespeare family home in Henley Street in Stratford-upon-Avon. And it was the spiritual last will and testament of John Shakespeare. And again, you know, there was, at the time, absolutely, the main Shakespeare scholar of the time said this is definitely genuine. Then there was a period of time where people thought it was a forgery, and now my understanding is the vast majority of scholars accept that it was genuine. So what is this spiritual will and testament? It's basically saying that I, John Shakespeare, want it to be known that I am dying a Catholic. And he lists about 12 or 14 things that he's making perfectly clear that he believes in. It's like going through the creed, including things that I want to make it known that I want to have a priest when I die. And if I can't have a priest when I die, I want it to be known that there was a desire for a priest. Now, what is this spiritual will and testament? It's an odd thing. And then a Jesuit scholar, early in the 20th century, discovered in Spain, and I think in another one in the Romance dialect in Switzerland, and another one in Spanish from Mexico, the exact same wording, but signed by different people. So what on earth is this all about? Different parts of the world. And it was traced back that this was a will that was composed by St. Charles Borromeo, who was a contemporary of Shakespeare and the Bishop of Milan. And there was a major plague in Milan. 17,000 people were killed. And it was impossible for the priests to give the last rites to everybody, people dying at this rate. There weren't enough priests. So St. Charles Borromeo issued this spiritual last will and testament around Milan for people to sign in case there was no priest for them in extremis in their dying moments. We know, because we have documentary records, that St. Edmund Campion and several other delegations of priests on their way from the English College in Rome to come back to England as missionary priests, probably facing death, that they stayed with St. Charles Borromeo, obviously just Bishop Borromeo at that time, in Milan. And he preached to them, and they were very impressed by him. We have correspondence from priests in England to Rome asking for more copies of the Testaments. And it's been said, well, maybe these are the New Testaments, the new Douay translation of the New Testament. First of all, the timing doesn't work because they weren't actually published till the year after these letters. You can't have more of them if they haven't even been published yet. And secondly, we have to remember that these priests were hunted. They were hunted like dogs. Now, this spiritual will and testament is a few pages and doesn't cost much money. You can secrete those and carry them around the country with you. You can't carry around boxes and boxes of Catholic New Testaments, even if you could get them into the country. So it's basically accepted now that what John Shakespeare had was one of these spiritual wills of St. Charles Borromeo. Why would they be brought to England? For the same reason as they were needed in Milan. There's not a plague, at least not a physical plague, there's a spiritual plague. But English Catholics, because of the fact that priests were illegal, may well die and have no priest. So they're signing them for exactly the same reason as the people in Milan were signing them. So this is obviously solid evidence for John Shakespeare, Shakespeare's father's Catholicism. Shakespeare's mother's side, the Arden family, is connected to all the major Catholic plots, in inverted commas, of the Tudor period, and indeed the Jacobean period afterwards. Her family is one of the most resolutely Catholic families there is. So basically, the evidence is overwhelming that Shakespeare was brought up in a militantly Catholic home. Let me say as well, at the moment, there were three types of Catholics in England. There were the church conformists, or the Catholic conformists, who basically were Catholic. They wanted the return of the Catholic faith, but didn't want any of the persecution, so they went to the Anglican services for a quiet life. These people basically lost their faith within a generation or two, lost their Catholic faith within a generation or two. And then there were the church papists, who went to church on Sunday. I should say, by the way, that you were fined for not going to church on Sunday, and you had to take communion, I think, at least at Easter, or at least once a month. I can't remember exact laws now. But basically, you had to go to the Anglican service. If you didn't, you were fined. So church papists would go to the Anglican service in order to avoid paying the fine, but would secretly go to the Catholic sacraments if they had the opportunity. There was a priest available. And then you had the recusants, who were the militant, hard-line Catholics, if you like, who refused to attend the Anglican services and suffered the fines. Shakespeare's father, John Shakespeare, was a recusant Catholic. He appears in 1592 on the recusant rolls. Now, evidence against that would be that he was involved, because he was basically one of the major civil officers of Stratford Council, in the destruction of the religious images in the Guildhall Chapel. Would a Catholic have taken part in that? Again, this is the trouble, trying to explain these subtleties of all this. In Protestant parts of the country, religious images were destroyed. They were mutilated. Swords were scratched over them. They were pulled down, and what have you. And it was done as soon as the law told them to do it. 1559, I think, the law was passed. In Catholic parts of the country, they ignored the law. They didn't carry it out. So there was a delay. In Stratford-upon-Avon, there was a visitation by the Anglican bishop, and the town councillors, of whom John Shakespeare was one, were ordered, because of the law of the country, to destroy the religious images in the chapel. And what they did was to whitewash over them. They had to do that, or else they would have gone to prison. But they didn't destroy them. The fact that it took 5 years, when they ignored the law, and a bishop's visitation to order them to do it, and then they whitewashed over them, painted over them rather than destroyed them, actually indicates their reluctance in carrying it out. And in his Spiritual Winter Testament, there's a rather resonant one where he confesses and apologizes for times when he's not been true to the church. Okay. There's a chapter in my book called A Rose by Any Other Name. It's a slight paraphrase of, obviously, a line from Romeo and Juliet, about the so-called Shakeshaft theory, whether Shakespeare went and, under the name of William Shakeshaft, served in a recusant household in Lancashire, when he left school. So I've got a chapter on that. I'm not going to say much about it. There's loads of literature out there, but I say at the end, ultimately, it's not all that important to the case one way or the other, though I do look at the evidence. Stephen Greenblatt in Will in the World really goes to town on this because his imagination runs riot with the whole idea of William Shakespeare sitting at the feet of St Edmund Campion, discussing literature and what have you. Okay, and then Shakespeare comes to London. There's the Lost Years, where he gets married and everything else, but obviously we don't have the whole day here. And he comes to London. The one thing we do know about Shakespeare is he has to leave in a hurry. He's hounded out of Stratford-upon-Avon by Sir Thomas Lucy, the local lord of the manor, if you like. Now, Sir Thomas Lucy is a militant anti-Catholic Puritan who carries out the persecution of Catholics with great relish. And there's all sorts of legends about the fact that Lucy, and Shakespeare wrote his first poem attacking Lucy, and Lucy was so outraged that he had him whipped and everything else. We don't know how much of that is true, but we do know that Sir Thomas Lucy forced Shakespeare to leave Stratford-upon-Avon in a hurry, and we do know Sir Thomas Lucy was militantly anti-Catholic. Okay, now, thus far, actually not all that controversial, because now many, many secular scholars in the last 5 or 10 years, including Stephen Greenblatt, including Michael Wood, have accepted, Peter Ackroyd, that Shakespeare is brought up Catholic. But what they say, he's brought up Catholic, he may possibly have died a Catholic. And there's a report at the end of the 17th century that he died a papist from an Anglican who didn't like Catholicism. So he had no reason to say it unless he'd heard it reliably. So they say, well, he was brought up a Catholic, a militant Catholic, and he may have died a Catholic, but in the meantime, in the middle, he becomes a good proto-secularist like the rest of us. Which conveniently for them is about the time he starts writing his plays, and he becomes a Catholic again conveniently just after he finishes writing his plays. So the battle lines really now are what evidence is there for Shakespeare's life, documentary evidence of his life, while he's in London. Okay. There's an awful lot of evidence that Shakespeare knew Sir Robert Southwell, the Jesuit, who was arrested in 1592 and put to death in 1595. We know it from allusions and dedications in Sir Robert Southwell's writing, one to Mr. W.S. We know it from the fact that the Earl of Southampton, who was also at this time a militant Catholic, Sir Robert Southwell was, we know basically this evidence from confessions under torture from Catholics, that Sir Robert Southwell was the Earl of Southampton's confessor. The Earl of Southampton, of course, was Shakespeare's patron. So I personally think from that, from parallels in the writing, from the fact that Shakespeare responds in his poem The Rape of Lucrece to St. Robert Southwell's request that he write something more spiritual, I think not only do the two know of each other, I think that there's strong evidence they knew each other. Not least because St. Robert Southwell was serving the Catholics of London, and there weren't that many Catholics in London, relatively speaking. Basically, in England, the further you got from London, the more Catholic it became. Quite simply because in those days it was difficult to enforce. It wasn't like modern technology where you can pass a law and rigorously enforce it everywhere at the same time. The further you got from the centres of government power, the less you could police the laws. There's also, my thesis is not that Shakespeare kept his Catholicism secret, but that his Catholicism was known to Queen Elizabeth and known to others, and basically he was considered a safe Catholic. In other words, one who wasn't going to start stirring up sedition against the crown, which means that obviously his Catholicism in his work is subtle. The reason I give this is the example of William Byrd, who, if you like, William Byrd is the preeminent musician in Elizabethan England, a contemporary of Shakespeare, where Shakespeare is the preeminent writer, William Byrd is the preeminent composer. William Byrd was known to be a recusant Catholic, in other words, a strong, defiant Catholic. He and his wife were actually dragged before the courts on 2 occasions. And the Attorney General, the Queen's Attorney General, in other words, on the orders of the Queen, quashed the case. Queen Elizabeth had favourites, and her favourites she would turn a blind eye to. And I think that Shakespeare's Catholicism was considered to be a safe Catholicism, as William Byrd's was considered to be a safe Catholicism. William Byrd wrote masses. At the same time, he wrote music for the established church. Okay, so we have this, Playing Safe with the Queen, the chapter's called. Walking the tightrope, and how that the tension of trying to remain a Catholic and trying to remain in the Queen's good favour is one of the tensions we see in Shakespeare's plays. In 1606, Susanna Shakespeare, Shakespeare's daughter, is listed as a recusant. Shakespeare's not listed as a recusant anywhere, as far as anybody's discovered, but he never went to the Anglican Church. And of course, the secularists say this proves he's a good non-believer like us. But Shakespeare's father never went to the Anglican Church either. Nor did his mother. Nor did his daughter, who was on the recusant list in 1606. Isn't it far more logical to assume that Shakespeare didn't go to the Anglican Church for the same reason that his parents didn't, and the same reason that his daughter didn't, than to assume he's a 21st century secular fundamentalist? Controversy, huh? And the other, if you look at the history of things, the Catholics were waiting for Queen Elizabeth to die. She lived on and lived on and lived on. And they thought when King James came to the throne, things would be easier. King James was married to a Catholic. His mother was Mary, Queen of Scots, who was a Catholic, of course, and beheaded for her Catholicism, amongst other things. So that when Queen Elizabeth dies, first of all, Shakespeare writes nothing by way of a eulogy of her, so much so that another poet accuses him of an ominous silence on the subject. But actually his plays at the time, Measure for Measure and All's Well That Ends Well, have this great liberated feel about them. They're the plays that he writes about the time that Elizabeth dies and James I comes to the throne. James tries to go easier on the Catholics, and by this time the power of Parliament, which is under the control of the Puritans, is so powerful, King James can do nothing to alleviate the plight of Catholics. I have no time to talk about the gunpowder plot, but I will do if someone wants to ask me a question on it. So what happens, of course, is that there's another clampdown on Catholics, and this really does lead to desolation. Because you can imagine the psychology of it. You've waited for nearly 50 years, for 45 years, for Queen Elizabeth to go away. She eventually goes away. There's a great sense of liberation for about 18 months. Then there's another clampdown. And that's why you get, at this stage, many Catholics finally caving in and conforming, and other Catholics, the militant ones, deciding to turn to terrorism, the gunpowder plot. And something of this desolation, almost despair, is seen in the plays that come immediately after Measure for Measure and All's Well That Ends Well, after this clampdown. The darkest plays Shakespeare wrote, perhaps: King Lear, Othello, Macbeth. And then the final thing that Shakespeare does before he leaves London is to buy the Blackfriars Gate house. Huge house. And what's the significance of that? Well, as the name would suggest, it was originally part of the Dominican Priory in London. It was obviously dissolved by Henry VIII. But it had always remained in Catholic hands. And there's all sorts of documentation, which I quote in my book, to show that it was basically a harbour of recusant activity in London. Had secret passages leading down to the Thames, the river, so that priests could get away. It had priests' holes, secret places where priests could hide if the house was raided. The house was raided. We have reports of that, all of which I cover in my book. And this place that we know was used as a hub from right back to the 1580s, when Shakespeare arrived in London, and was still being used at the time he left. Now, he buys that place. Why does he buy that place? Again, the secular scholars say it was an investment. I say, yes, it was an investment. It was a spiritual investment. Because he wanted to make sure it stayed in safe hands. The person who was a tenant there, John Robinson, before he bought it, remained as a tenant after he bought it. John Robinson's brother, in 1613, the year in which Shakespeare buys that house, goes off to Rome to study for the priesthood. 4 years after Shakespeare's death, a secret room at the top, the floor collapses, killing quite a few people while a mass is going on. So it was used for clandestine activities, clearly including mass, from the time Shakespeare arrived in London, when he bought the house, and was still being used 4 years after he died for the same purposes, as a hub of Catholic activity. When he dies, if you look at the names of the people on his will, the vast majority of people on his will are local militant Catholics in Stratford-upon-Avon. So he goes back and mixes with the same Catholic families that he'd mixed with when he was young. And the only one of his London connections who's with him in the final days of his life and who signs his will is John Robinson, the brother of the priest who was the tenant at the Blackfriars Gate house. So, what I try to show in my book, and I think I show beyond all reasonable doubt, that Shakespeare was born into a Catholic family, remained a Catholic, including during the times he was writing his plays, and died a Catholic. And just before I finish, I want to just say one quick thing about, I'm going to write an essay at some stage and try to get it published in some Protestant journal, why Protestants shouldn't be scared of the Catholic Shakespeare. And the reason they shouldn't be scared of the Catholic Shakespeare is because Shakespeare is not particularly interested in a dialectic between, the Church and Luther. What he's interested in is the situation that Catholics find themselves in England, which is a dialectic between traditional Orthodox Christianity and virtue and Machiavellian realpolitik, which is the Elizabethan spy network, which had led to, again, there's 40 canonized martyrs of England and Wales, 85 beatified martyrs, many other martyrs who have not been officially recognized by the Church. The Jesuits were hanged, drawn, and quartered. I won't give you the details if you don't know them, but there aren't many brutal ways of killing somebody. And this spy network, they basically found Catholics, found ways of compromising them, blackmailing them, getting them to spy on their fellow Catholics. Machiavellianism. So in Shakespeare's plays, the recurring motif is between traditional Christian virtue of his heroes and heroines and the Machiavellianism of his villains. And basically, it's a dialectic between Christianity and secularism. So ironically, the Catholic Shakespeare not only is not a threat to Protestants, is actually a threat to secular fundamentalism, which is why this is very controversial and why many Shakespeare scholars around the world will fight this notion as much as they can. So what I like about this, to finish, is that it's something like the ghost of Hamlet's father. Shakespeare, the ghost of Shakespeare, has returned from the dead and declares to Shakespeare scholars in secular academia that there's something rotten in the state of academia. Thank you. Okay, I obviously left loads of stuff out and rushed other stuff, and I apologize for that, but the reason was so that we can have some good controversy now. So,
I was hoping you'd say a few words about Denmark and about Hamlet, and about Hamlet being a student in Wittenberg. And I don't know if you've come across anything interesting in your studies just regarding the play Hamlet.
yeah, I mean, as I said, that I'm less confident at present about explicating particularly difficult plays like Hamlet, where every critic disagrees with every other, until I've done my research. If I get invited back next year, it won't be on Shakespeare, mind you, but I'll give you better answers then. But clearly, the one thing that does come out, and again, the arguments about this from Hamlet, is the recurring theme in Shakespeare of illegitimacy, usurpation. Because again, you have to understand, for Catholics in England, Elizabeth is not even a legitimate monarch, because she's the bastard daughter of Anne Boleyn. And the divorce was not granted by the Pope. And illegitimate children cannot be monarchs. So, you know, this whole notion of the true ruler being usurped and overthrown is something we see in several of the plays, and Hamlet is obviously one of them. Now, the connection about where they study is obviously a nod in the direction of the Reformation, but I just heard, when I've had discussion on it, arguments in both directions about that, and I haven't got my head around it enough to give you a specific answer that I'm happy with, and I don't want to give answers I'm not happy with. So, yeah.
I think this particularly grasp. So, it seemed like kind of the burden of the argument lies in dealing with defining what it means to be a Catholic in that moment. I mean, of course, in contemporary discourse, we can be pretty confident of what that means. And I'm just thinking in Shakespeare's time, it seems like with the publication of the 1570 papal bull, Regnans and Excelsis, which excommunicated Elizabeth and absolved the subjects of allegiance to her, and essentially said it would be a mortal sin were she to be assassinated, because of her illegitimacy, precipitated this sort of give and take between recusancy and then crackdown in the early 1580s, which resulted in execution of Cathy and many others. And I'm wondering if it might be more fruitful to look at this question of Shakespeare's Catholicism through the lines of what really mattered was the political import of the papacy and adherence to the papacy. Because it's not like, I guess what I'm concerned with is that as scholarship of the Reformation in Shakespeare in the past couple decades has shown, people didn't wake up on a Thursday and were no longer Catholics, we're Anglicans, the term which didn't exist at the time. So I'm wondering if it might be helpful to localize it as the English crackdown against Catholics as a suspicion of a political adherence to the papacy, more so than a care about.
Well, certainly many Catholic scholars criticize the Pope for issuing that bull on pragmatic grounds. But on principled grounds, I think the Pope was valid in doing so. The trouble is, of course, was validated in doing so, or justified in doing so. The problem, of course, is that, the similar situation would be, was Pope Pius XI justified in condemning Nazi Germany, which he did on many, many occasions, in spite of that Cornwall's book. But once the Nazis started getting brutal, the Pope issues an encyclical condemning them, or an apostolic letter condemning them, and then there's a clampdown on Catholics. The Catholics are sent to concentration camps. So after which, of course, the Pope's a bit more careful about what he says about Nazi Germany, because he's obviously concerned about his subjects, the Catholics in the Third Reich. So I suppose the same situation applied to Catholics in England in the 16th century. Not only in the way that the Church dealt with the issue from beyond, and again, there was vacillation. At some stage you have these hardline approaches, and other times we get, it's okay for Catholics. By the time we got James I comes to the throne, it's tacitly accepted by the Church that a Catholic can go to an Anglican service with his or her master. In other words, if someone in the King's train, in James I's train, goes to an Anglican service with him, they're not committing, as long as they don't partake of communion, they're not actually committing a sin, which was certainly not what was said 30 years before. So, it's all about the real nitty-gritty of politics on the ground. And, of course, for poor Catholics, how do they respond? Now, if you're going to be fined, and the fines increase exponentially the longer you're away, and basically be ruined economically if you don't go to Mass, it's only the most resolute who remain recusants, which again emphasizes exactly how resolute the Shakespeare family were in their Catholicism, that John Shakespeare and Susanna Shakespeare are actually listed as recusants at various times. But it's obviously a very, very difficult situation for consciences, the whole Jesuitical notion of equivocation. I quote an example here, and I haven't noticed that any scholar spotted it. There's a quote about the Blackfriars Gatehouse when the Elizabeth's men raid it looking for priests. And they're asked directly whether there were priests there, and we don't exactly know what was said at the time, but there's a letter a few days later from the master of the house, who was conveniently away at the time, where he basically, in about 150 words, makes it sound as if there would never be any priests in his house without ever actually saying that. So it's a perfect example of equivocation, where he's not lying, but he's given the impression there would never be priests in his house, when in actual fact he never says that there weren't. And we do know from another autobiography that there were priests in the house at that time. They just weren't found. So, all of these difficult issues that people have to live with when you're in what we would now call a totalitarian state in many ways.
I'm just interested in separating out the definition of sort of a Catholic faith and practice from sort of a pagan Catholicism, which might have interested me more, and might have also given Shakespeare the flexibility to, for example, in King John, it's very clear that King John speaks of the Pope and delivers a message to the Pope that's post-Reformation moment, where he seems to be freely, being able to denigrate the authority, the spiritual authority of the Pope. I'm just wondering if there's a way to move in that.
Well, again, for Catholics in England, there were two schools, as you know. There were the Jesuits were the hardliners, and the Marian priests, the old priests who had been ordained under Queen Mary, that were still around and still had certain rights as Catholic priests, were much more moderate and just thought the Jesuits were troublemakers, and if everyone was just quiet and behaved themselves, eventually everyone would be nice to the Catholics. Where the Jesuits said, you can't basically get in bed with the devil. I mean, that the Jesuits were no nonsense. So, again, there are times in Shakespeare's plays where he seems to be playing lip service to anti-Catholicism. Yes, there are. Although they're outnumbered by the times when Catholic characters and Catholic religious characters are actually presented in a very good light. And the fact that he always chooses history, which is Catholic, and Italy, or the continent, which is Catholic, as the setting for his plays, is also, I think, significant. It's sort of the past is another country. It's also a Catholic country. And part of the reason for that, of course, is you weren't allowed to talk about politics domestically, so he had to put some sort of distance. But, so the fact that, what I was going to say, the fact that Shakespeare the evidence seems to suggest it's weaker for Campion, I think, for his relationship with Campion. But the relationship with Robert Southwell seems to be fairly strong. So the fact that Shakespeare seems to have aligned himself in friendship with Jesuits, suggests, again, that as with his father and his daughter, he was on the resolute end of that spectrum rather than the accommodating end of that spectrum, I would suggest. Yes?
What did you learn about the Hathaway family and their religious affiliation? And why would such a good Catholic man leave his wife and small children?
Good question. Well, I never said he was a good Catholic man. Well, again, we don't know as much about the Hathaways, but the evidence that we do have is that they were Catholics, but we don't know much about them. But they were a Catholic family. They went to a lot of trouble not to get married in the local parish church by the Protestant pastor. Now, it's said, of course, that's because Anne was pregnant, and that may have been part of the reason. But the fact is that where they did choose to get married, in Shottery, there was a Catholic priest, a Marian priest. So they were married by a Catholic priest. And you did have to get married in the church, because otherwise it was illegal. Marriage was illegitimate, and with all the legal complications attached to that. So, when it says Shakespeare was baptized in the Anglican Church, well, yes. But, if you were completely opposed to Bill Clinton's government, but you had you got married, you would still have to sign the registry of the local civil government. It wouldn't mean that you supported it. It means you want your marriage to be legal. So, now, why did he leave his wife and family? Again, we don't know for certain. We do know he left in a hurry. And we do know he left in a hurry, at least all the evidence we have suggests that he left in a hurry, and he left in a hurry because of Sir Thomas Lucy, who, as I said, was a militantly anti-Catholic, persecutor of Catholics. And there's all sorts of stories about why Shakespeare left because of Lucy's persecution, whether it's because of poaching or because of this slandering Lucy. But that's another issue. So he left in a hurry. There's an interesting sonnet in which Shakespeare, it seems to be the one sonnet we know was addressed to Anne, and in the last line of it, it basically, it was the penultimate line, I think, it says that that Anne saved my life. That's the play on the words. Now, again, it's been in the past, was always presumed this was Shakespeare's earliest ever poem and was maybe composed for Anne during their courtship, or maybe as a wedding gift. But if you take it literally, then maybe it was something he wrote later, and maybe she had to lie for him, equivocate for him, lie for him to get away. We don't know, but that's an interesting textual thing. He came to London, say perhaps forced to leave Stratford-upon-Avon. The question would be, if he's forced to leave, why did Anne not leave him, join him in London? And she obviously didn't. Now, again, there's two possibilities. He left her. I mean, of course, the standard secular thing is he's an artist, and this is what artists do, of course. That he had to follow his muse, and any self-respecting artist can't have children around them because they're distracting. So he leaves his wife and children, and that's a virtuous thing to do. So thus for their position. But he could have left them. He could have left them because there was say he seems to have left in a hurry. But why did they not get back together again? It could be because it was already estranged, and when he left, he might have thought, well, thanks be to God, I had an excuse to get away from that situation. Or it could be that when eventually they got back together again, we don't know when. We do know that Shakespeare went back and forward between Stratford and London. But when they got back together again, perhaps there was an estrangement. That it might have been caused by the separation, if you see what I mean, rather than a separation being a result of the estrangement, that the separation causes the estrangement. And the other possibility is that actually they actually continued as husband and wife from a distance. We know he went back regularly. The first thing he does in Stratford-upon-Avon that we know of after he leaves is to come back and buy a house, for Anne and the children, so they can move out of the Henley Street house into New Place. And that's the house he moves back into himself. And he wrote about 2 plays a year. And it's not inconceivable. People always assume that he was drinking in pubs, in taverns in London all the time and getting drunk with his friends. It's not inconceivable. He spent a large part of the year in Stratford-upon-Avon writing plays. So because we just don't know. So it's this idea that he was completely, for 15 years his wife never saw him, it clearly isn't the case. But whether she saw him once or twice a year, or whether she saw him for 2 or 3 months once or twice a year, we don't know. So, but we do know, of course, he moves back in with them when he retires. The whole thing, by the way, of him leaving her his second best bed is a load of nonsense. I mean, that's what it does say in the will, but it was standard practice to leave. The second best bed was the marriage bed. The best bed was the guest bed. So all he's left her was their marriage bed. If anything, it was a term of endearment, not a snub. Because you often hear, he hated her so much, all he left her was their second best bed. He actually left them the marriage bed. So again, all these things need clearing up. Okay.
My impression of a lot of the New Catholic historiography, it's kind of been common since the 1980s, a lot of the stuff you're drawing on, is that a lot of this information, not all of it, not all quite put together, but a lot of it had been known to Catholic scholars since the late 1800s and had been very, very vigorously repressed by the Protestant academic establishment. Part of what's striking is that the new resurgence in the 80s and then the 90s of a lot of this research, it got embraced by left-wing academics because now they were on the side of the Catholics because they were the persecuted class. Mm-hmm. So there's one way that this stuff has now gotten a grip in the academy in a way it never could before. Because you not only had Catholic scholars on the side of it, you had left-wing anti-establishment scholars on the side of it.
Yeah, that's certainly largely true. The other thing is that you have to remember, this is romantic. Shakespeare is being brought up in a family of outlaws, being hounded by the state. He might possibly have known St. Edmund Campion, who's hanged, drawn, and quartered. He might have known St. Robert Southwell, who's hanged, drawn, and quartered. Much more interesting than, So there's that romantic aspect of it. As regards to scholarship, you're right, of course. I mean, Richard Simpson in the 19th century, Father Bowden built upon that. That was the research that Shakespeare knew of when he was talking about, that Chesterton knew of when he was speaking about Shakespeare's Catholicism. And one thing very interesting, actually one of the most important scholarly works on the Catholic Shakespeare is a book called, which has been published as a book, called The Shakespeares and the Old Faith, and it's by John Henry de Groot. And he's actually a Presbyterian, and it was a doctoral thesis. He's an American in Massachusetts, I think, somewhere in New England. And it was his doctoral thesis sometime around the end of the Second World War, late 1940s. And it's brilliant. And this man cannot be accused of bias. He's obviously done his research diligently, and again, it's a good doctoral thesis. It's footnoted, 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 footnoted. This is solid stuff, and it's really irrefutable. So the point is now, of course, that as I said, they've fallen back. The secularists have fallen back on position 2. We can't deny he was brought up a Catholic. He might have died Catholic. There's certainly evidence that he might have died Catholic, but he was, he lapsed from the faith when he came to London, wrote all his plays, which are wonderful secular anti-Christian things, and then lapsed into senile superstition before he died again. So that's the position of the secular. That's the position of the secular academy now, and that's where the battle line is now, basically, in the Shakespeare wars. Okay, should we take 2 more questions, maybe, if there are 2 more, and then there aren't 2 more. That's wonderful. Thank you very much.